On the morning of June 6, 1918, the people of Kyiv who lived near Lisa Hora were watching a breathtaking and brutal spectacle. An unusual fireworks display began over the Zverinets fortress. Hundreds of flares were shooting up into the sky. However, the unusual show didn't last long. After that, real hell began. Several powerful explosions thundered, shaking the entire city as if it were an earthquake. This is how Kyiv experienced its first, but unfortunately not its last, large-scale man-made disaster, the explosion of artillery warehouses at Pechursk in the Zverinets fortification. It became a serious test both for the residents of the city and for the authorities of the young Ukrainian state. Today, there is little doubt that the Kyiv explosions of 1918 were not a random tragedy, but the result of a well-prepared act of sabotage. In this episode, we will take a detailed look at the Zverinets tragedy, its consequences, its scale, and identify the most likely culprit. You will also learn how the people of Kyiv behaved in this critical situation, what conclusions the official investigation reached, and why the Moscow archives are still closed. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's begin. A bit of history. Zverinets is a historical area located in the modern Pechursk district of Kyiv. It is located between the railroad highway and the Nadnepriansky highway, Mikhailo Baichuk Street and Petro Bolbachan Street. A long time ago, during the times of Kievan Rus, this area was covered with dense forests where princes and other notable citizens loved to hunt. That's where the name Zverinets comes from. In pre-Mongol times, there was a country palace of the Kievan princes here. They say that Yuri Dolgoruki and Danilo Halitsky stayed there as guests. Then, a small settlement appeared on Zverinets, which belonged to the nearby Vidubichi monastery. By the beginning of the 19th century, this was a sparsely populated, poor area adjacent to Pechursk. The situation changed on the eve of the War of 1812. In anticipation of the impending conflict, Russian military officials became concerned with defending the southern borders. It was decided to strengthen the Kyiv fortress by building a new fort in the Zverinets district. Everything was done properly, with bastions, ramparts, and artillery batteries. Inside the fort, there were ammunition and provisions warehouses, barracks, and dugouts. But Napoleon advanced on Moscow not through Kyiv, but went straight at it through Smolensk. So the fortification at Zverinets, like the entire Kyiv fortress, never got a chance to see any fighting. By the mid-19th century, the Zverinets fortifications had lost all military significance. There were proposals to demolish them, but the state treasury simply didn't have the funds for such work. Instead, the fortress premises began to be used as army warehouses. Over time, ammunition and explosives began to be stored here, which later played a fatal role. I don't know what the Tsarist generals were thinking, but the idea of placing huge warehouses of explosive materials within a large city looks, to put it mildly, questionable. It remains to add that by the time of the events described, the population of Zverinets had increased significantly. The Trinity and Ioninsky monasteries were opened on one of the Zverinets hills, and in 1914-1915, the buildings of the Alexeyevsky Yunker School were constructed here. Today, this building houses the Ivan Bagun Lyceum. Civil construction was also actively underway. Before the revolution, there were 39 dormitories, 44 shops, and 8 schools here. According to the 1917 census, the total population of the district and its immediate surroundings was about 10,000 people. That was only until the summer of 1918. The Zverinets Catastrophe, and then the summer of 1918 came. By that time, there was a huge arsenal in the warehouses of the Zverinets fortress, about 2 million artillery shells. They were sent directly from here to the southwestern front. That averaged out to about 5 shells for every resident of Kyiv at that time. There were 22 artillery magazines with shells on the territory of the fort, as well as residential and storage barracks with auxiliary materials. Here I should say a few words about what was happening in Kyiv at that time. In the summer of 1918, it was the capital of the young Ukrainian state, headed by Hetman Skoropadsky. Unfortunately, the main support for the hetman's power was the German occupation troops. It was they who ensured order and security in Ukraine. Under Skoropadsky and the Germans, life in Kyiv returned to its usual peaceful course. The townspeople gradually began to forget the horrors of the past months, with the constant changes of government, artillery shelling, and street fighting. But alas, this peaceful idyll was shattered on the morning of June 6, 1918. It all began with an unusual fireworks display. Hundreds of signal flares shot up into the sky over Zverinets, which greatly amused the residents of the surrounding neighborhoods. After that, the fortress was shrouded in smoke, and then a huge pillar of fire rose into the sky. Eyewitnesses claimed that it was about a kilometer high, which is of course hard to believe. Then there were several monstrous explosions that literally made the city tremble. The first of them occurred around 10 a.m. It was followed by a second, then a third. The windows facing Kreshchatik all had their glass blown out. The secretaries and I were almost knocked off our feet when we ran to the windows and looked down at the street covered in shattered glass. Here and there, people probably knocked down by the blast wave were lying around. My ears were ringing from the noise. Some of the ladies had hysterics. This is how Dmytro Dontsov, one of the future founding fathers of Ukrainian nationalism, who at that time was the head of the Ukrainian Telegraph Agency under the government of Pavlo Skoropadsky, recalled the events. That morning, Dmytro Dontsov came to his office early. There was a lot of urgent work to do, but he didn't manage to get anything done. The windows in the university building were shattered, sometimes together with their frames. Students and professors rushed outside. Bricks and plaster were falling from the buildings. The blast wave tore doors off their hinges. The glass wall of the state bank on Institutska shattered into pieces. Frightened employees ran away, leaving documents and boxes of money unattended. The glow of the fire could be seen even in Irpin. The blast wave on the Dnipro overturned several ships. The powerful detonation scattered shells for many kilometers, causing new destruction. Kyiv. Shrapnel munitions, leaving characteristic whitish clouds in the sky. At the epicenter of the disaster in Zverinets itself, it was real hell. This is how the newspaper Kyiv Thought described the events. I quote, "The shock wave is so great that the tall wooden fences of the Zverinets streets, the roofs of houses, sheds, and other small structures fly into the air like splinters and fall far from where they were torn off. The Zverinets church, standing on a rise and overlooking a long row of newly discovered ancient caves, collapses like a house of cards. The vast area of the raging fire is growing, and it seems as if a territory of several versts is burning." The disaster caught Hetman Skoropadsky at his residence on Shelkovokhnaya. Together with Prime Minister Lizohub, he hurried to Zverinets, where he witnessed a horrifying scene. The vast area of Zverinets, built up with small houses, was engulfed in a continuous fire, and explosions kept going off in different places. The explosions caused terrible panic. The terrified residents of Zverinets fled their homes and ran toward the city center. Here's how an eyewitness described it. People were running, not knowing where, climbing over fences, ditches, gates, through other people's yards and gardens. People, carriages, trams, everything got mixed up into one mess. Women were fainting in the streets. There were cases of death from heart rupture. Soon, Pechersk and then Kreshchatik were filled with crowds of people, many of whom were half-dressed and covered in blood. There was a very understandable reason for such mass panic. 4 months before the events described, Kyiv had experienced a real shock. It was stormed by the Bolshevik army under the command of Muravyov. At that time, the city was subjected to heavy artillery shelling. 7,000 shells were fired at it, including some with poisonous gases. Those events led to the deaths of hundreds of Kyiv residents. The wildest rumors immediately spread throughout the city, claiming that the Bolsheviks had mined all of Pechersk and that it had completely blown up, including the Lavra. They said that in the morning a mysterious airplane circled over the city and dropped the deadly bomb on Zverinets. Then a rumor spread through the city that there were canisters of chemical weapons stored in the warehouses, which understandably caused a new wave of panic. The people of Kyiv looted the warehouse with gas masks, and people began showing up at hospitals convinced they had gas poisoning. Many years later, these events were described in his novel The White Guard by Mikhail Bulgakov. However, he moved the site of the explosion from Zverinets to Bald Mountain, to the fort of the same name. The aftermath of the explosions and the cleanup. The explosions at the Zverinets fort had very sad consequences for Kyiv. About 200 people died, and more than 1,000 were hospitalized in serious condition. However, many contemporaries, as well as current researchers of the tragedy, doubt the accuracy of these numbers, believing that the authorities deliberately understated the data on the victims to quell panic. Many city residents were injured by shards of broken glass, but did not go to hospitals and treated themselves. The explosions and the subsequent fire destroyed more than 900 private houses. The buildings of the Ioninsky and Trinity monasteries were also severely damaged. About 12,000 people were left homeless. The total area affected by the shell explosions was 4 square kilometers. Almost the entire Zverinets was destroyed by the explosions and burned to the ground. The response of the authorities and various emergency services to the tragedy was prompt and quite effective. The heroic Kyiv firefighters were the first to battle the fire. However, there was little they could do. Powerful explosions hindered the fight against the fire. Several firefighters lost their lives. The firefighters were only able to resume their work on June 8th, when the explosions became less frequent, but by that time almost the entire Zverinets had burned down. Only small pockets of fire remained. Almost immediately, the army joined the rescue operation. More than 1,000 soldiers worked in the very heart of the disaster. They extinguished fires, rescued people and their belongings, and prevented new explosions. Among them were many dead, and even more wounded. The military and police also cracked down on looting. Those who tried to profit from others' misfortune were dealt with harshly. Several criminals were killed while resisting or attempting to escape. The area of the tragedy was additionally cordoned off by German troops. They took every measure to prevent the fire from spreading to the Lysogorsky fort, which was located nearby. There were large stocks of pyroxylin and cylinders with poisonous substances there. If the fire had reached that place, no one would have gotten off lightly. Within an hour after the first explosion, medical assistance was organized for the victims. All night, into the morning of June 7th, at the site of the disaster under a hail of shells, bullets and shrapnel were flying nearby as medics and Sisters of Mercy worked alongside the military, providing assistance to those in need. A medical station was opened at the Junker School. By 3 p.m., 1,500 beds had been prepared for the wounded in hospitals and infirmaries. The injured were transported not only by ambulances, but also by service vehicles from various departments, as well as carriages and carts belonging to ordinary Kyiv residents. On the very day of the disaster, a relief committee for the residents of Zverinets was formed, which collected more than 1 million rubles in 3 months, a very impressive sum for those times. Approximately the same amount was allocated by the Skoropadsky government. Free food distribution points were set up very quickly in all districts of the city. People who lost their homes were accommodated wherever possible. 3 charity films were even made about the explosions in Zverinets. All the proceeds from their screenings were directed to help the victims. Hetman's government planned to build several residential blocks for the fire victims, but didn't manage to do it in time. Negligence or sabotage. Almost immediately after the explosions, a government commission was formed to count the number of victims, assess the damage, and determine the causes of the tragedy. The investigation was lengthy and thorough, as both Skoropadsky's investigators and the Germans actively searched for those responsible. 2 theories were investigated: sabotage and simple negligence. When it comes to deliberate sabotage, there were again 2 possibilities: Bolshevik agents or the intelligence services of the Entente countries, Germany's opponents in World War I. The people of Kyiv were absolutely certain that the artillery depots in Zverinets were blown up by Bolshevik spies. In the end, the commission concluded that the explosions were accidental. The explosions were not accidental. One of the guards decided to repair a box of signal flares without first bothering to unload them. The flares exploded, which started a fire that led to such catastrophic consequences. Later, another version appeared. Apparently, one of the sheds where old papers and other junk were stored accidentally caught fire. For some reason, there was an old explosive charge there, which exploded, causing a fire and detonation. It can be said that the exact cause of the explosions at Zverinets was never determined at that time, and no specific individuals were named as responsible for this tragedy. All of this looks very suspicious and seems more like an attempt by the authorities to cover up the real reasons for the tragedy, and in a very clumsy way at that. It must be said that very few people believed the explosions at Zverinets were accidental. And there were good reasons for that. The thing is, the Kyiv explosion wasn't the only one. On July 31, an ammunition depot in Odessa also blew up. And on September 13, a similar incident happened in Kerch. There were casualties and serious destruction here as well. For example, in Odessa, one of the city's districts was burned out. 700 people were killed or seriously wounded. On June 14, a week after the explosions in Zverinets, a terrible fire broke out in Podil. And once again, no culprits were found. A large firewood warehouse caught fire and the flames spread to neighboring houses. 35 houses, 2 steam mills, a distillery, and 14 building supply warehouses burned down. If the wind hadn't died down, Podol would have burned to the ground. Tens of thousands of people would have been left homeless, just like in Zverinets. If a single explosion could still be blamed on accidental negligence, then a series like this looks much more like a deliberate and well-organized campaign, directed against the young Ukrainian state. The only question is, who could have been behind it? The then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Doroshenko, argued convincingly in his memoirs that the Odessa terrorist attack was directed by French diplomats in Chisinau and Italian diplomats in Iași. A similar point of view was expressed in a secret report to Vienna by an officer of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. He thought the terrorist attacks in Ukraine were organized by the Russian Entente allies, the Denikin forces. However, such a claim raises doubts, because large-scale sabotage operations are too different from the usual methods of the Allies. And besides, Ukraine was the last thing on their minds at the time, absolutely the last. It's not hard to believe the Bolsheviks were involved in the tragedy. At that time, Ukraine was literally teeming with their agents, so they had no problems finding people to carry out their plans. The Bolsheviks never gave up on their plans to seize Ukraine by force, so weakening its military potential through large-scale sabotage seems like a logical step. It is worth remembering that back in early 1918, Bolshevik unit leaders Ivan Fedko and Zhavaderov declared their readiness to blow up ammunition depots in Kerch so that they would not fall into the hands of White Guard and Ukrainian bands. It didn't work out then, but the second attempt a few months later turned out to be much more successful. Here's another curious point. In Soviet times, the story of the explosions at Zverinets was carefully hushed up, which is strange in itself. After all, it was truly an important and large-scale event. The archives are still closed, and not just those related to the Kyiv explosions, but everything concerning Moscow's actions in Ukrainian territories during the Civil War. And finally, a few words about the fate of Zverinets itself. It should be said that even before the tragedy of June 6, Skoropadsky's government had started removing ammunition from the warehouses, but simply did not have time to finish what they had started. After the residential buildings in Zverinets were destroyed, the hetman decided to move the government center of the capital here. For example, he promised Volodymyr Vernadsky that he would allocate a significant area here for the Academy of Sciences building, as well as to build a new university. To move the parliament and most ministries, Professor Fomin proposed to establish a botanical garden on the site of the destroyed fort, which was also approved. Design work began, but they did not manage to complete it. First, Skoropadsky was overthrown by the Directorate, and then the Bolsheviks took power. By the way, they did not abandon the idea of creating a botanical garden in Zverinets, which was established in 1935. It still delights the people of Kyiv and guests of the Ukrainian capital. While walking through it, you can notice some strange hills and mounds here and there. That's all that remains of the Zverinets fort. Conclusion. The explosions at Zverinets can't really be called a unique case. This has happened more than once or twice, both in our country and abroad. Here, it doesn't matter if these warehouses exploded on their own or were caused to explode. The cause of the tragedy is still human negligence and stupidity, because only that could have inspired the brilliant idea to store several million shells within the limits of a large city. Well, as they say, if in the first act of a play there's a gun hanging on the wall, then in the last act it must inevitably go off. And that's exactly what happened. Well, that's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.